I'd like to welcome Ethiopia to the stage for the lightning talk.
So thank you, Andrew, for the kind introduction. It's good to be back on the African continent. As Andrew indicated, I'm a native son who the vagaries of life took elsewhere and the IFC brought back home. I grew up in Ethiopia and have vivid memories of the energy of commerce there. The open market spaces, the variety of different goods, the bright colors, the noise of people buying and selling their wares. These markets seemed able to unite people of different backgrounds, ethnicities, and religions, while affording all of them a livelihood. And I have to confess, as a child, I didn't give much thought to how these markets worked. But then I had the good fortune to pursue a professional career dedicated to markets. And I began to understand that they required some form of organization, some structure, and some rules. In my career, I had the chance to help build a regulatory framework for capital markets in emerging economies. And I've seen the impact that capital markets have on economic growth, on jobs, and on living standards. Singapore is a prime example of what a conscious effort to create a world-class market and regulatory framework can do for economic growth, prosperity, in just a matter of decades. I've also witnessed a few market failures, from the manipulation of the copper market in the late 90s, to the bursting of the internet bubble in the beginning of the previous decade, to the financial frauds at Enron and WorldCom, and the related demise of the Arthur Andersen accounting firm, and of course, the subprime crisis that led to the recent widespread recession. And these failures afford very valuable lessons on what makes markets work. Given the conference's theme of accelerating economic development, I wanted to address two areas this morning: what capital markets can do for development, and what it takes to make markets work. So financing needs in Africa are substantial. $48 billion per year is needed for large infrastructure projects. And between $140 and $170 billion is needed to finance the continent's small and medium-sized enterprises. And domestic capital markets could be a big part of the solution. The capital markets around the world serve as terrific intermediaries, matching capital with large financing needs. They are effective in channeling savings and other funds to priorities such as infrastructure and SMEs. They improve the allocation of capital and risk, leading to greater economic stability. And they protect against capital outflows and reduce reliance on the banking system. Simply put, they fuel economic growth, they create jobs, and better the lives of millions of people. And African capital markets hold tremendous potential. Before 2006, only one country in sub-Saharan Africa had issued a sovereign bond, South Africa. Since then, over $25 billion have been raised in Africa, $7 billion of which was just raised in 2014. Yes, it's still short of the $48 billion infrastructure funding gap, but that is a lot of momentum gained in a very little bit of time. In Kenya, they topped $9 billion. In Namibia, they're reaching $10 billion. Across the region, we're talking about nearly $400 billion in pension funds. Now imagine if just 10% of that was used to help Africa's corporations grow into regional and global firms. In addition to pension funds, domestic insurance companies, investment funds, and other financial institutions are growing. All are prospective capital market players. Then consider the trillions of dollars of managed money around the world, In 2013, assets controlled by institutional investors in OECD countries grew to over $92 trillion. Sovereign wealth funds by themselves manage an estimated $6.5 trillion in assets. Imagine if Africa could capture a fraction of these funds for corporate financing. Africa's current momentum creates an unprecedented opportunity to accelerate the region's economic and social development. It is essential for Africa to seize the moment. So what would it take? Today, when we think about global capital markets, we tend to think of the world's great financial centers: New York, London, Tokyo, Hong Kong. But this focus on the largest and most modern markets misses an important point. This point is that each and every market is similar and unique. Similar in that they all respond positively to certain fundamentals, but unique in the environment and tradition in which they develop and prosper. For example, the US capital market stands at approximately $56 trillion. This is a huge number connected to a complex market. But its size and complexity obscures the simple fact that the US capital market is just a market. Markets, in one form or another, have existed in every society since the dawn of recorded history. And despite the size and complexity of modern trading places, the market fundamentals of today are exactly the same as those that permitted markets to function thousands of years ago in ancient Sumeria, Egypt, Phoenicia, China, and in Bantu, Swahili, and Semitic cities in Africa. These fundamentals are simple. They include a place where buyers and sellers can meet. The place can be a simple bench under a buttonwood tree, which is how the New York Stock Exchange got its first start more than 200 years ago. It could be an old-fashioned trading floor, or the Rwandan Stock Exchange, or it could be the virtual space of the internet. Second, there must be property rights. Buyers and sellers must have some legal right to control and transfer the items traded. In ancient times, these rights were recognized by custom or possession. Today, they usually involve laws. Either way, without these rights, markets cannot exist. Third, and most importantly, markets require trust. Trust is the lubrication that keeps the wheels of a market from grinding to a halt. It is the faith that a buyer is buying what he or she expects, and the faith that the seller will receive payment promised at the time promised. And this faith has never been blind. Without this basic trust, no market in the world, no matter how technologically sophisticated, will succeed. If I were to walk down to Nyarunjenje, I wouldn't have the same line of credit as a local. In the informal markets in Africa, trust is based on your family, reputation, and the relationships you've built within a small community. In the diamond markets in New York and Amsterdam, trust is based on ethnicity, religion, and the personal interaction of a handful of traders. The markets work because of the reputation and the small community that makes up these markets. With the anonymous trading that characterizes modern capital markets, this personal trust has been replaced, per force, by a surrogate: best practices, securities laws and regulations, and their vigorous enforcement. So, how do we go about building trust in a capital market? The answer to the challenge of building trust is not so much about the number of laws or regulations, but rather about the principles and behaviors they seek to establish. One of the underlying principles governing trust is transparency. Transparency is essential. To earn trust, participants in the market need to be completely transparent to their investors, clients, and regulators about their practices, their conflicts of interest, and their risk profile. Reliability and credibility are also essential to trust. Investors need to have assurance that the information disclosed to them is accurate, complete, and verified. It gives them confidence that they have a sound basis to judge the value of what they are buying. So accountants and auditors are absolutely critical in enabling the transparent and accurate financial reporting that underpins investor confidence and trust. Credit rating agencies are key actors in rebalancing information asymmetries by providing information about creditworthiness of companies to lenders and investors. And finally, the trust is built on knowing there is a public or private cop on the beat. Clear rules and credible enforcement are crucial. Without a doubt, government and governments have to play a central role in creating the regulatory framework that fosters market trust. But it takes time. Many of you in this room represent other players in the capital markets: companies, accountants, auditors, rating agencies, and I would urge you to do your part in building trust in the market, drawing on the lessons of informal markets across Africa. They work not because of a regulator, but because all parties adhere to the established principles and behaviors. But in building a capital market, it's also wise to keep in mind that it's paramount to understand the perspective of investors whose capital is at stake. It is their money. And the understanding should not fall into the trap of being superficial. In illustration of the importance of perspectives, let me raise a topic that may appear to be a bit of a digression: cheese. Clotaire Rapaille is a French psychiatrist and cultural anthropologist who has devoted himself to uncovering the meaning and decoding the thoughts that lie at the heart of different cultures. He describes his work as psychoanalyzing a culture. Rapaille has observed that in France, cheese is alive, which means that you can buy cheese that is young, mature, or old. In France, you have to read the age of the cheese when you go to buy it. You smell it, you touch it, you poke it. If you need a cheese for today, you buy a mature cheese. If you need a cheese for next week, you buy a young cheese. And when you buy a young cheese, you never, ever put the cheese in the refrigerator for the same reason that you don't put your cat in the refrigerator. The cheese, like the cat, is very much alive. By way of contrast, Rapaille has observed that in America, cheese is dead. Because the cheese is pasteurized, it is legally and scientifically dead. In America, you buy cheese wrapped in a little plastic body bag, and you take it home and you put it in the refrigerator, which Rapaille claims is like putting it in a cheese morgue. The smell matters much less in America than it does in France. The most important thing is that the cheese is safe. Americans want safety before taste, and the French want taste before safety. What I like about Rapaille's work is that it demonstrates that even when you're talking about something as mundane as cheese, we bring to the conversation a multitude of different assumptions and expectations. So take the time to understand investors' perspective. All right. So in the end, if you give me a moment here, the development of domestic capital markets in Africa has the potential to provide capital to drive economic growth, job creation, and improve the lives of millions of Africans. And in the end, I've made just 3 points. Remember, a capital market is simply a market. It is fueled by trust, and it is the investor's perspective, whose capital is at stake, that matters most. So know their minds. And now it's up to all of us to build these markets and to protect them. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I just wanted to, after that conversation, that talk, that lightning talk, just give the audience an opportunity, Ethiopia, if there were any particular questions on the 3 points that Ethiopia's illustrated with that conversation. If I can just pause and see. I obviously have a question, but I just want to see, I have a question here. I have a microphone.
Yes, David Marsh, thank you, Ethiopius. It was a wonderful way of starting the day. Are there any role models that you might look at abroad You've mentioned America and France, so we'll take those out of the equation. Any role models in terms of how to set up efficient, workable regulatory structures that could function well in Africa?
So yes, I mean, you know, you're right. The U.S. actually is a very bad example by virtue of how it developed over a longer period of time. If you're interested in figuring out how to do it in a shorter period of time, the model that I would point to is actually Malaysia. Malaysia has done a terrific job in a very short period of time of building a very credible regulatory framework that has grown the capital market there in significant ways, providing alternative financing for companies in addition to bank financing. To my mind, based on the years of working with counterparts around the world when I was at the SEC, I think the Malaysian Securities Commission and the authorities in Malaysia did a terrific job of building a capital market in a short period of time, taking into account many of the things that I talked about in my presentation.
Can I see if we have any other? The gentleman here, please.
Thank you very much. William Asiko from Investment Climate Facility for Africa. My question is regarding national versus regional markets. You find that in Africa there are many small markets, sometimes to an extent that they may be uneconomical. What is your perspective on national versus regional markets? You've pointed to the difficulty that you encounter sometimes in national markets. They tend to be small and there may not be enough liquidity. So a regional market makes a lot of sense. Challenging, though. There have been many attempts at creating regional markets, and they usually founder on the politics around reliance on one another in terms of supervision and enforcement. But there's some recent attempts which have some promise. But that's usually where they founder. You should probably start by looking at integration of platforms and allowing cross-border investment by citizens, and then progress slowly to harmonization of laws, and then progress slowly to maybe a single regulator for the region. But that last bit is usually difficult. It means reliance on others, and that tends to be challenging for governments, and not just in Africa, but it proves challenging in other places. We had conversations about this when I was in the United States, thinking about how it is we might rely on the regulation of counterparts in developed markets like the UK, and facilitating access by US investors to those markets. And even in that context, it proved difficult. It was difficult for us to consider that we would let somebody else be responsible for the well-being of our investors. But I take your point. I think it is something really to explore. Regional markets have the potential to actually get you where you need to go, where a national market, a good idea, there may not be enough liquidity to make it work.
Can I take another question just before we hand over to Louise, who will be emceeing the next part? There's a gentleman with his hand raised just at the back there, sir.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I want to ask a simple question. Is there any general rule or principles to guide governments to determine at what stage in the development of capital markets should they introduce what you call capital gains tax? At what level of development would you kind of recommend governments to come in or not to come in?
I think I'm very ill-placed to advise you on what it is a government should actually decide to charge capital gains taxes. But I do think that the timing of government intervention is an important consideration. Frequently, what I've seen in the work I did previously is government would intervene too early in the process of the development of a market. You actually have to let the market and the market players progress to a certain point before you start really putting in restrictions as to how the business takes place. Having said that, what is most important in terms of government intervention is being the cop on the beat. One of the things that troubles investors is not knowing whether or not when things go wrong, if there is wrongdoing, there will be somebody to look for the wrongdoing and to vindicate their interests. So generally speaking, although regulation can take a little bit longer to develop, the actual enforcement of fraud and wrongdoing at the outset by the government is an important piece of the puzzle.
Right. Ethiopius, thank you very, very much. If I could lead a round of applause for that lightning talk.